At 7:42 a.m. on October 3, 1939, a line of cadets stood on the windswept airfield of Kasumigaura Naval Air Base, northeast of Tokyo. Their faces were motionless, eyes fixed on the horizon where training aircraft looped through the gray morning sky. Each man had spent years in selection, medical tests, and physical endurance trials. Only a fraction had survived this far. The instructor's voice carried across the tarmac. 10 perfect landings against the wind, or you are finished. It was not an exaggeration. For the Imperial Navy, imperfection was failure, and failure was a form of death. By the late 1930s, Japan's Imperial Navy operated one of the most rigorous flight training programs in human history. The system was built on the ideal of perfection. Every maneuver, every landing, every reaction drilled until it became absolute reflex. Cadets logged more than 1,000 flying hours before earning the right to wear wings. In comparison, American or British pilots averaged fewer than 200 hours at graduation. The intention was noble, to produce the finest warriors in the air. Yet this philosophy contained its own poison. The process was so long, so selective, and so physically brutal that the pipeline could not replace losses once the war began. A single combat-ready aviator represented years of effort by hundreds of instructors and technicians. When such a man was lost in combat, the Empire lost not only a pilot, but an irreplaceable investment of time and skill. Every training accident, every death in practice, was accepted as proof of devotion to the Bushido Code. The Navy measured success not by efficiency, but by purity of performance. It had built a machine of excellence so refined that it could not survive the attrition of total war. When war erupted across the Pacific, the early months seemed to validate Japan's doctrine. The Zero fighter, flown by men forged through years of extreme training, dominated the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. Allied pilots described the encounters as hopeless duels against opponents who moved with mechanical precision. But behind those victories lay a silent crisis. Each fallen ace represented a void that could not be filled. By mid-1942, during the Battle of Midway, the Imperial Navy had lost more than half of its elite aviators. Replacement programs were ordered, but the established curriculum demanded years of preparation. The instructors refused to dilute standards, convinced that shorter courses would dishonor the tradition of mastery. Returning veterans found their training fields eerily quiet. Hangars that once held dozens of aircraft now sheltered a handful of cadets. The classrooms still echoed with lectures on aerodynamics and discipline, but the faces were younger, less confident, and fewer with each passing month. Japan's air power was consuming itself. The very system that had created its champions now ensured that no generation could follow them. Among the instructors who remained, a few began to sense that the problem was not enemy technology or tactics, but the mindset of perfection itself. One of them, Lieutenant Commander Masao Sato, had trained pilots since the mid-30s. From the flight line, he could identify students who would live or die simply by the way they handled crosswinds. What disturbed him was not their skill, but their rigidity. They reacted flawlessly to rehearsed conditions and failed instantly when the unexpected occurred. During evaluation flights, Sato noted how students repeated textbook maneuvers even as weather and fuel changed unpredictably. Their instinct was to preserve form, not survival. After each fatal crash, the reports cited pilot error within specification, a phrase that became both confession and excuse. Sato realized the system rewarded discipline more than adaptability. To him, the true failure was psychological. Pilots were not learning how to fly. They were learning how to obey gravity with honor. The difference was subtle but lethal. As Sato recorded in a private note that year, our cadets are not preparing for war. They are preparing for judgment. Inside the Imperial Navy, reform was nearly impossible. Every procedure, from the cadence of salutes to the tension of control cables, was bound by layers of hierarchy and ceremony. To question the doctrine of training was to question the soul of the institution. The manuals had been written not only by engineers, but by philosophers of discipline. They treated flying not as a skill, but as an act of moral purification. The structure of command ensured obedience. Each flight instructor had once been a cadet beaten into conformity by the same system. Their loyalty was to the method that had broken and rebuilt them. A man who had survived such trials found identity only in perpetuating them. The result was a cycle of sacred suffering. Brutalize the few to inspire the many. When reports reached Tokyo that Allied forces were producing thousands of pilots in mere months, the response was not alarm but contempt. Japanese officials saw quantity as vulgar. They measured value by endurance. Better one eagle than 100 crows, read a statement from the Naval Air Bureau in 1942. The sentiment was poetic and strategically fatal. The longer the war continued, the more this rigidity revealed its cost. To become a pilot, a candidate endured a rejection rate above 95%. The process began with thousands of volunteers drawn from middle schools and technical colleges. Only a handful reached the flight line. Each was examined for eyesight, coordination, and obedience under stress. A mistake in etiquette, a hesitation in orders, could end a career before it began. The survivors advanced to pre-flight academies where their daily routine bordered on monastic punishment. Wake-up call at 4:30. Physical drills until dawn. Classroom lectures in meteorology, physics, and moral education. Meals timed to seconds. Even handwriting was inspected for discipline. Every action was judged as a mirror of inner spirit. Instructors enforced a code that fused military precision with Zen detachment. Cadets were taught that the cockpit was a shrine, the aircraft an extension of the emperor's will. To question orders, even in simulation, was to defile the divine chain of command. Crashes were treated not as mechanical faults, but as moral failings. Funerals for dead trainees were brief and silent. The next morning, flying resumed as if the deceased had simply evaporated. This culture left no space for practical adaptation. When Sato suggested reducing the total training hours to accelerate replacements, his memorandum was rejected within hours. The supervising admiral underlined the margin with a single phrase: "Perfection is the only defense." Yet beneath the surface, instructors like Sato were torn between faith and reality. They watched attrition rise and morale fall. The same ideal that had once united the Corps now isolated it from the changing world. As the empire expanded into the Pacific, bases like Kasumigaura, Tsukuba, and Apama struggled to produce enough pilots even to maintain existing squadrons. By late 1942, new cadets faced shortages of fuel, spare parts, and aircraft. Many trained on outdated models long retired from combat. The obsession with precision forced them to repeat textbook exercises even when their planes could barely stay airborne. Sato recorded that one group of trainees practiced landings using engines that misfired every 5 minutes. They learned nothing except endurance. When the first rumors arrived of America's industrial mobilization, hundreds of new planes built every day, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. Japan was perfecting a few men to fight an enemy mass-producing thousands. But still the Navy would not change. In the words of one senior officer, "A nation of craftsmen cannot think in the language of factories." This was the tragedy of overtraining. The system that forged the world's most disciplined pilots could not evolve fast enough to sustain them. Their courage was real, their skill unmatched, yet they were trapped in a design that mistook sacrifice for strategy. The perfection of the few had become the doom of the many. By early 1943, Lieutenant Commander Masao Sato had reached his limit. He had trained dozens of cadets only to watch them die within months of deployment. Each time he stood on the flight line, he could recognize the pattern before the mission even began. Their posture, too rigid. Their eyes, too focused. Perfection had become paralysis. Sato began quietly rewriting the syllabus in secret. Officially, his unit followed the Imperial Navy's doctrine of precision aerobatics and flawless formation flying. Unofficially, he introduced lessons that prioritized survival over ceremony. He removed half of the ornamental exercises, the endless loops, the roll sequences performed only for inspection, and replaced them with emergency landings, evasive dives, and fuel management under combat stress. At night, he personally flew with the students in weather that the regulations forbade. He would cut the throttle midair, simulating engine failure, and order them to improvise. Many panicked, freezing at the controls as they searched for textbook procedures. Sato forced them to act instinctively, to feel the aircraft rather than obey it. "You cannot honor the emperor," he said once in private, "if you are already dead." His behavior bordered on insubordination. The written manuals were sacred documents reviewed by the Naval Air Bureau itself. Altering them was an offense that could end a career. To conceal his deviations, Sato kept 2 ledgers, one for inspection, one for truth. In the official record, he logged perfect compliance. In the hidden version, he tracked survival rates. Over months, the results became undeniable. The students who trained under Sato performed fewer ceremonial maneuvers but survived more often during mock combat. They developed flexibility that the standard program forbade. When confronted with crosswinds, they landed safely instead of attempting flawless symmetry. When instruments failed, they relied on instinct, not procedure. The success drew attention. Other instructors began asking why Sato's cadets scored so high in tactical assessments. Some suspected falsified results. Others believed he possessed unique intuition. But the truth spread through whispers, not reports. "He teaches them to make mistakes," said one young officer admiringly, "and then to recover." By mid-1943, Sato's reforms had become an underground current within the training system. Younger instructors copied his methods quietly, omitting his name. They shared fragments of advice: teach feel, not form, written in notebooks or carved into hangar walls. What began as one man's rebellion turned into a quiet contagion of pragmatism. Yet Sato knew his position was precarious. When a visiting admiral from Tokyo arrived to inspect the base, all unauthorized material had to disappear. For 3 days, instructors repainted hangars, burned documents, and rehearsed official drills to create the illusion of orthodoxy. The deception worked, but only barely. Sato was summoned afterward for questioning. The admiral asked why his pilots had logged fewer total hours than regulations required. Sato replied carefully, "Because they have not needed to repeat perfection." The admiral said nothing. He simply dismissed him with a look that could have meant warning or respect. After that, Sato stopped writing notes altogether. He understood that the only proof of his method would be measured in lives saved, not papers filed. His defiance continued in silence. Every flight became a risk, not just of death, but of exposure. Each time his students took off, they carried both his teachings and the secret that those teachings existed. In the context of the Imperial Navy, such quiet rebellion was unprecedented. Sato was not a revolutionary. He was a craftsman confronting the limits of his craft. By teaching imperfection, he was committing heresy. But for the first time, the doctrine of unbending perfection met a force it could not erase. Human survival instinct refined into discipline. When war is a machine, the smallest act of independent thought can be its only mercy. For Sato and his cadets, that mercy took the shape of unauthorized lessons under a silent night sky. By the autumn of 1943, the Imperial Navy's air campaign had entered a new and desperate phase. The Solomons and Rabaul became killing grounds where the once invincible Zero now met disciplined opposition from the United States Navy. For Lieutenant Commander Sato, this was the test no inspection board could simulate. Several of his former students, now full pilots of the 11th Air Fleet, were thrown into these battles with almost no rest. He waited for casualty lists that seemed inevitable. The first reports came back in fragments. One survived after ditching in the sea. Another limped home on one engine. A third downed an American Wildcat, then vanished in cloud. To the bureaucracy in Tokyo, such partial data meant nothing. To Sato, they meant proof that men could now adapt, improvise, and sometimes live. Months later, intelligence summaries revealed a subtle pattern. Squadrons trained under his methods recorded survival rates nearly double the fleet average. The statistics were unofficial, buried among operational noise, but the contrast was clear to those who looked. These pilots were less ornamental, more pragmatic. They conserved ammunition, broke formation when necessary, and escaped instead of dying in scripted duels. Interviews with captured American airmen later confirmed the difference. They described a new type of Japanese opponent, less ceremonial, more tactical. Gone were the endless vertical spirals and suicidal turns that had defined early war engagements. Instead, these pilots attacked once, disengaged cleanly, and re-entered from altitude, mimicking Western energy fighting doctrine. No one in U.S. intelligence knew why. Within the Japanese ranks, this quiet evolution had no official name. It was simply referred to as practical flying. The expression carried a faint note of disapproval among traditionalists, yet results spoke louder than ideology. A commander who lost fewer men was tolerated, even if his methods were unorthodox. Sato never claimed credit. He maintained outward conformity, reporting that his cadets followed the prescribed curriculum. The data supporting his deviations circulated only by rumor. Other instructors copied his approach without attribution, blending it with their own improvisations. What emerged was a fragile network of unofficial competence stretching across the remaining naval air schools. In combat, that network became visible only through survival. When American pilots later studied Japanese gun camera footage, they noticed an unusual calmness in certain dogfights, an absence of reckless showmanship. These were likely Sato's men or those taught by his imitators. Their flying looked less mystical, more mathematical. They had transformed Bushido into a quiet calculation of energy and risk. For the Imperial Navy, this adaptation arrived too late to reverse the tide. Fuel shortages and industrial collapse limited the number of sorties each pilot could fly. Yet, within those constraints, the change mattered. A handful of veterans began returning from missions instead of dying gloriously. They carried with them living evidence that survival could itself be honorable. Sato received no decoration. His superiors could not reward a man for breaking the rulebook they had written. But he noticed a difference in the tone of official memos. Where once reports demanded absolute perfection, they now included the phrase, priority on combat readiness. It was bureaucratic understatement, but to him, it was recognition disguised as language. By the end of 1943, Sato's graduates formed a small minority of Japan's remaining experienced aviators. Their endurance allowed them to train others informally in the field, spreading the mutation further. Each sortie they survived became a message that doctrine was not destiny. History would not remember their names. The archives record only unit codes and aircraft losses. Yet within those numbers lies the evidence of a quiet revolution, one that turned a religion of perfection into a science of survival. In the winter of 1943, the Imperial Navy's Air Training Command began to fragment under pressure. Fuel was scarce, aircraft parts were rationed, and instructors were rotated to combat zones faster than replacements could arrive. What had once been a centralized system of precision now became a network of desperate improvisations. Within that chaos, the quiet mutation initiated by Sato began to spread. It spread not through orders or memos, but through conversation, imitation, and survival. When cadets from different bases met during refueling stops, they exchanged rumors in canteens. At Kasumigaura, they teach you to stall on purpose, one would whisper. At Optima, they make you fly blind in fog. These small deviations, each forbidden, each useful, circulated like contraband. The institutional structure remained rigid, but its edges softened under the weight of necessity. By mid-1944, some training officers openly acknowledged that the war's pace demanded a new rhythm. Cadets who once trained for 5 years now graduated in less than 1. The curriculum shrank, but the essence of Sato's heresy survived inside it. Teach function over form, reaction over ritual. Even those who had never heard his name repeated his logic unconsciously. Field reports from forward bases recorded unusual patterns. Young pilots, though undertrained by old standards, displayed higher adaptability during their first missions. They made crude repairs in the field, adjusted tactics, and ignored protocol when survival demanded it. None of these behaviors appeared in manuals. They were instincts inherited from a reform that had never been declared. The paradox was striking. The Empire had designed a system that idolized perfect control, yet it was collapsing precisely because control was impossible in total war. The more centralized the doctrine became, the more power flowed to individuals who dared to bend it. Across Japan's island outposts, survival became a decentralized act of resistance. Among officers, opinion divided sharply. The traditionalists, those who still believed in the sanctity of Bushido, considered these adaptations signs of decay. To them, dying in flawless form remained preferable to living through compromise. Others, including a quiet minority of engineers and logisticians, recognized that pragmatism was the only path left. They saw Sato's influence as an invisible antibody inside a dying organism. Evidence of this undercurrent appeared even in propaganda materials. Early war posters had celebrated the heavenly eagles, pilots whose devotion erased fear. By 1944, new slogans emerged emphasizing skill preservation and valuable experience. The tone was subtle but telling. The Navy no longer promised transcendence, it promised efficiency. Inside the bases, the culture shifted in small, nearly invisible ways. Morning roll calls became shorter. Inspections less ceremonial. Instructors allowed cadets to voice technical doubts, once considered impertinent. The transition was never formalized, but veterans noticed. One recalled years later, "We stopped bowing to the aircraft and started listening to it." Despite this evolution, the larger war context was catastrophic. Japan's industry could no longer sustain the attrition rate. The United States, armed with superior logistics and radar-directed tactics, gained overwhelming air superiority. Each new Japanese pilot entered a sky already dominated by enemies. The practical training that Sato's approach encouraged could not compensate for material collapse. Still, its existence mattered. This silent spread of realism prevented an even greater disaster. Without it, casualty rates among late-war trainees might have approached annihilation. Instead, small groups survived long enough to record their experiences, forming the core of Japan's post-war aviation knowledge. In a grim irony, the unofficial doctrine that had violated imperial standards became the seed of Japan's later civilian flight programs. No document ever credited Sato or his contemporaries. The imperial archives were destroyed or sealed before surrender. What remains are scattered flight logs showing anomalies in training hours and unconventional maneuvers listed as field improvisation. Historians analyzing these data decades later identified consistent patterns linking back to Sato's methods. In every military system, there exists a point where obedience collides with adaptation. Japan's overtrained pilots reached that threshold sooner than any others in the Second World War. Their transformation from instruments of ceremony to agents of survival illustrates the paradox of war's intelligence. Perfection breeds fragility, while imperfection evolves. By the time Japan faced the final battles of 1945, the virus of flexibility had fully replaced the old faith in flawless control. It arrived too late to save the empire, but it saved fragments of its humanity, the instinct to live, to learn, and to change. By 1944, American intelligence officers had begun to notice subtle changes in Japanese aerial behavior. At first, analysts at Pearl Harbor dismissed them as random variations caused by pilot fatigue or mechanical shortage. But after reviewing combat footage from the Solomon Islands and the Marianas, patterns emerged that contradicted previous assumptions. The Imperial Navy's air arm, long considered predictable and ritualistic, was adapting. Gun camera film revealed dogfights in which Japanese pilots no longer clung to tight-turned circles or vertical loops. Instead, they executed high-speed disengagements, broke formation deliberately, and re-entered combat at oblique angles. These were not the textbook maneuvers of the pre-war Heavenly Eagle doctrine. They resembled energy tactics used by Western forces. To Allied analysts, the change was unsettling. A new type of opponent had appeared, disciplined yet flexible, less concerned with honor than with outcome. Reports from surviving American pilots confirmed the shift. One carrier pilot, Lieutenant Jack Munson, wrote after the Battle of Rabaul, "They used to stay until they burned. Now they fight like we do, strike and vanish. Harder to read, harder to kill." It was a grudging respect, born not from admiration but from surprise. The psychological advantage the Allies once enjoyed, the certainty that Japanese pilots would never disengage, was fading. At the same time, American naval planners recognized the strategic contradiction within Japan's air war. Even as its pilots grew more pragmatic, its industrial base was collapsing. The United States could replace entire squadrons monthly. Japan could barely maintain fuel for training flights. The new competence therefore appeared as isolated sparks within a dying system. Intelligence summaries concluded, tactical improvement observed, strategic impact negligible. They were right, but they underestimated the human story beneath those statistics. Inside Japan, Sato's quiet revolution remained invisible to the enemy. The U.S. Navy saw only the outcomes, not the philosophy behind them. Yet, even this limited awareness affected Allied doctrine. Instructors at American training schools began warning recruits not to underestimate Japanese flexibility. "They're learning faster than we expected," one curriculum update read. "Their courage remains the same, but now it is disciplined by reason." For the Japanese high command, these small victories in adaptation created internal tension. Traditionalists at Naval General Headquarters saw deviation as contamination. They insisted on restoring spiritual balance through renewed emphasis on the Bushido ethic. Propaganda shifted toward martyrdom, culminating in the formal sanction of special attack units, the kamikaze. Ironically, this institutional return to ritual suicide emerged precisely when field experience was proving the value of survival. Sato and those like him watched this reversal with quiet despair. They had fought to reintroduce life into a culture obsessed with death, only to see policy reclaim the narrative of sacrifice. In letters later found among surviving students, several described the contradiction. "We are trained to live, yet ordered to die." The tension between human pragmatism and ideological fatalism became the defining tragedy of Japan's air war. From the Allied perspective, the introduction of kamikaze tactics erased the memory of Japan's brief rational phase. To American historians, the image of the suicidal pilot became the enduring symbol of Japanese aviation. Few outside Japan ever learned that, before the final collapse, a movement had existed to prevent exactly that outcome. Operationally, the shift in Japanese tactics forced Allied units to adapt as well. Dogfights over the Philippines and Okinawa became more cautious. U.S. pilots were instructed to respect Japanese disengagements as potential ambushes rather than signs of weakness. Engagement ranges increased, and formations grew looser to counter sudden vertical strikes. What had begun as Sato's training rebellion now echoed invisibly through enemy manuals thousands of miles away. The psychological balance of the air war subtly changed. For the first time, American pilots spoke of the enemy as professionals rather than fanatics. They no longer assumed superiority by doctrine, but by logistics. The moral clarity of the early Pacific campaign, civilization versus fanaticism, blurred into a recognition of shared skill and endurance. In the post-war years, Allied analysts retrospectively traced the evolution of Japanese air tactics. They found no central directive explaining the mid-war change. The only consistent clue was anecdotal. Reports of certain instructors emphasizing practical flying and combat intuition. Western historians dismissed these as anomalies until captured documents revealed the name of Lieutenant Commander Masao Sato, buried in administrative logs of Kasumigaura Air Base. His name appeared only once, beside the phrase, disciplinary inquiry, no action taken. To intelligence officers reviewing the archives, the entry meant nothing. To historians decades later, it became a symbol of the paradox that defined Japan's pilots. Men overtrained for perfection, yet forced by war to rediscover imperfection as strength. From a technical standpoint, the Allied reaction to Japan's late-war adaptability was methodical rather than emotional. U.S. training manuals incorporated new case studies emphasizing adaptability under stress, the very principle Sato had risked punishment to teach. In an unintended symmetry, the lesson he smuggled into Japanese classrooms returned across the Pacific, formalized and industrialized. The battlefield, however, allowed no philosophical reflection. As fuel reserves dwindled, Japan's remaining pilots fought with increasing desperation. Those trained in the pragmatic school often died beside recruits taught to embrace death. The difference between them was invisible in the smoke of combat. Yet to those who studied their maneuvers, the distinction remained clear. Even at the end, some fought to survive, not to vanish. For American crews, the experience produced a complex mixture of respect and pity. In debriefings after Okinawa, one aviator said, "They trained them too well to live in a war that wanted them dead." It was an accidental epitaph, one that described both the brilliance and the futility of Japan's overtrained warriors. Thus, the enemy's reaction was not triumph, but recognition. They had encountered a mirror image of themselves, pilots disciplined by obsession, consumed by their own systems. In that reflection lay the final irony of the Pacific Air War. Both sides learned the same lesson, but only one had time to apply it. After the surrender in August 1945, Japan's surviving naval aviators returned to a homeland unrecognizable from the one they had left. Cities lay in ruins, airfields were cratered, and the emperor's voice, once divine and unreachable, now echoed through broken radios announcing defeat. For the men who had lived through the air war, silence became their only uniform. Those who had trained under Sato or by his indirect influence carried no proof of their achievements. There were no citations, no commendations, no official acknowledgement that they had defied the system to keep others alive. In the bureaucratic records of the disbanded Imperial Navy, such actions did not exist. The very success of their survival had been built on secrecy, and secrecy does not earn medals. Many resumed civilian lives in anonymity. Some became mechanics in small garages or flight instructors in newly formed civilian schools. Others abandoned aviation entirely, taking jobs in factories, farms, or shipping companies. They rarely spoke of their wartime experience. When asked, they described it as a duty completed, nothing more. The cultural weight of defeat demanded humility, and humility erased memory. Sato himself lived quietly in Yokohama, teaching aeronautical engineering at a vocational institute. His students knew him as a patient instructor with unusually practical methods, emphasizing feel, judgment, and precision tempered by flexibility. Only a few former Navy men recognized traces of his wartime doctrine in his lessons. He never mentioned his service record, and his office contained no insignia or photographs from the war years. In 1952, during Japan's slow re-entry into international aviation, a group of engineers from the newly formed Japan Airlines sought advice on pilot training. They approached several former military officers, including Sato. He declined formal employment, but offered them a short memorandum summarizing his principles: simplicity in procedure, freedom within discipline, and adaptability over ritual. These ideas quietly shaped Japan's civil flight schools for decades. The post-war government, seeking to distance itself from militarism, avoided honoring any figure associated with wartime innovation. The public narrative centered on collective suffering, not individual reform. Thus, Sato's name disappeared from textbooks, replaced by discussions of technological inferiority and strategic miscalculation. The human dimension, the effort of individuals who tried to correct a doomed system, remained buried. Yet among former aviators, stories persisted. Veterans met in informal gatherings, often in seaside towns where old air bases once stood. They shared memories of instructors who had taught survival instead of ceremony. The phrase became a quiet badge of respect. In those small circles, Sato's influence was acknowledged with understatement. One former cadet, interviewed in the 1980s, said, "He didn't save the empire, but he saved people." That was enough. Archival researchers later uncovered fragments of correspondence hinting at Sato's enduring conflict with his own conscience. In a letter to a colleague, he wrote, "I taught them to live, but it meant teaching them to disobey. That is the burden I carry." The line reveals a paradox at the heart of Japan's wartime psychology, that morality could reside not in obedience, but in quiet rebellion. The state offered no recognition for such nuance. Official history preferred the clarity of sacrifice, the kamikaze narrative that glorified death as the ultimate expression of loyalty. Within that mythology, there was no place for men who had chosen life. As a result, Japan's most rational pilots were forgotten, their pragmatism absorbed into the machinery of national amnesia. Sato died in 1972 at the age of 58. In his small apartment, relatives found a single box labeled records. Inside were maintenance manuals, a few photographs of cadets standing beside training planes, and one folded note written decades earlier. It read, "They learned to survive." That was enough. The phrase echoed the sentiment that had driven him since the war's early days, the belief that endurance itself was an ethical act. In a nation where obedience had been sacred, he had redefined duty as preservation. His quiet defiance offered a rare glimpse of moral evolution within the machinery of total war. Today, historians studying Japan's wartime aviation recognize the paradox of its pilots, the most overtrained warriors of the conflict, forged by a culture that worshipped perfection but strangled innovation. Their story illustrates that the pursuit of absolute control can destroy the flexibility required to survive. Among them, Sato's legacy stands as a reminder that sometimes the greatest service a soldier can render is not to die for his country, but to teach others how to live. When historians describe the air war in the Pacific, they often focus on machines, the Zero Fighter, the Hellcat, the Corsair. But the Rabaul story lies in the minds that flew them. Japan's naval aviators embodied one of the most complex psychological paradoxes of modern warfare. Men so expertly trained that they became unable to adapt. Their downfall was not ignorance, but the perfection of discipline itself. The Imperial Navy's training system represented the pinnacle of pre-war craftsmanship. It produced pilots with reflexes honed to near mechanical precision, vision calibrated to daylight combat, and courage molded through ritual humiliation. Yet the same rigor that created brilliance also eliminated flexibility. The men who once dominated the skies entered a conflict where survival depended not on mastery, but on evolution. Sato's quiet rebellion revealed what the system could never admit: that war is a field of uncertainty, not ceremony. His students prove that adaptability, even when born of disobedience, is the true measure of skill. Their story contradicts the myth of national character, showing that courage is not a cultural artifact, but a human constant capable of transformation. After the war, Japan's new civil aviation programs unknowingly inherited fragments of Sato's logic. Training shifted from spiritual indoctrination to procedural safety. The emphasis on judgment under pressure, the principle that had once been forbidden, became a cornerstone of modern flight instruction. What began as heresy in a military hangar evolved into standard practice in commercial cockpits. The legacy of Japan's overtrained pilots endures not in monuments or medals, but in philosophy. They teach that excellence without adaptation is fragility, and that loyalty without conscience is servitude. In every army, in every age, systems built on perfection risk collapsing under their own symmetry. A single photograph survives from Kasumigaura Air Base, taken in late 1941. It shows a group of cadets standing before a row of training aircraft. None of their names are recorded. Among them may be men who died at Midway, men who survived to train others, or men who carried Sato's unspoken lessons into the future. Behind their still expressions lies the entire contradiction of Japan's wartime spirit: discipline elevated to art, humanity buried beneath precision. If one truth emerges from their history, it is that the measure of a soldier's worth is not found in how perfectly he obeys, but in how wisely he disobeys when obedience leads to ruin. Sato never sought vindication. His legacy rests not in victory, but in correction. Through him, we glimpse the strange redemption that can exist inside defeat, the understanding that the most valuable knowledge in war is the capacity to learn from its own failures. Thus ends the story of Japan's overtrained warriors, a generation shaped to embody perfection, undone by it, and quietly redeemed by those who dared to be imperfect.